Thank you all for joining us. This is an amazing panel of people who have a lot to talk about today. Thank you all for being with us. I want to especially thank Congressman John Lewis for not only his unwavering leadership, but his moral courage and his constant effort to speak truth to power and to be heard for Americans all across this country. It's shameful that more than 50 years after the Voting Rights Act was passed, Congress is still debating whether to make it easier or harder for American citizens to vote. And as we know so well from the last presidential election, this is not an abstract theoretical question. In fact, the Supreme Court ruling 2 years ago had a real, tangible, consequential effect on America's voting population, and it's our responsibility, all of us here, to correct that. Because when local governments pass restrictive ID laws, it disproportionately hurts our minority communities, our students, our seniors, and our low-income Americans. When men and women are waiting hours in line just to cast a ballot, it's clear that there is a real problem with our voting system. So we need to do everything we can to make sure that no American citizen is blocked from casting their vote on Election Day. This conversation today is an important opportunity for all of us to come up with good and real solutions that would make it easier, not harder, for Americans to have their voices heard on Election Day. Thank you so much. Our first speaker is Congressman John Lewis, who continues to lead the movement on voting rights in America.
Well, thank you very much, Senator. Thank you for having me here and my colleagues from the House here. Thank you for calling and pulling us together. This is the first time since the National Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965 that the presidential election would not be covered by the Voting Rights Act. We've made a great deal of progress during the past 50 years. But without the protection of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, we can go backward. You know, Senator, I've said on many occasions that the right to vote is precious. It's almost sacred. It is the most powerful, non-violent tool that we have in a democratic society, and all of our citizens must be allowed to use it. During the past few months and years, I've traveled across the country, and I know that there is a deliberate, persistent, systematic effort to make it harder and more difficult for the disabled, student, senior, minority, the poor, and rural voters to participate in the democratic process. That's not right. It's not fair, and it's not just. The tactics may change, but the will remain the same. Since the Supreme Court decision, Georgia cut the numbers of early voting days to half. Florida made it more difficult to run voter registration drive. My colleagues here from North Carolina eliminated same-day registration, any pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, and enacted photo ID requirement. It is a shame and a disgrace that Congress has not taken action to fix what the Supreme Court broke. Now, this may not be the time or place to say it, but in days past, when there was a national election, the President of the United States, the Attorney General, and the Department of Justice could appoint observers. And I think when we meet here today and the election coming up in a few days, we should call upon the administration that in certain states, we should ask for federal protection, federal observers. The election can be stolen on election day at polling places. We have to be mindful and watchful. Places like Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Ohio, and many other places, this is our time to speak up and speak out, to say that we want to see fair and open election where everybody can participate.
Thank you so much, Congressman. I'd now like to call on Ben Cardin.
Well, Senator Gillibrand, first of all, thank you for your leadership on this issue and so many issues. It's good to be here with my colleagues. It's particularly good to be here with my friend, Congressman Lewis. The two of us were elected together to serve in the 100th Congress, and it was, we've been friends ever since. And Congressman Lewis, we all are inspired by your continued leadership on civil rights issues. And your observations about this election is absolutely accurate. Congressman Butterfield and Senator Durbin and I have traveled on behalf of Helsinki, and we have participated in human rights discussions. And we very frequently comment about free and fair elections in other countries. I just commented as the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in regards to the Russian parliamentary elections. And one of our major points is to make sure that we have free and fair elections in countries around the world. But the United States' credibility is being challenged, because if we don't take care of business at home first, we lose our ability to make this world safer through democratic institutions globally. And we are being challenged. The Voting Rights Act, as Congressman Lewis pointed out, has been weakened by the Supreme Court. We could have corrected it, and we haven't taken action yet to correct it because the Republican leadership is blocking us from doing that. We need to make sure that we have the full protections of the Voting Rights Acts in our elections, and this election, it will not take place. By the way, the OSCE will be monitoring our election here in the United States, and I'd be interested in their observations when the elections are over. But we need to do more than that. We have people who live in the District of Columbia don't have full voting participation here in the Congress. That's an outrage. That's a violation of basic rights. We've got to correct that. We have returning citizens that are not allowed to vote in elections. We got to change that. There are things that we need to do in America to make sure that people have the right to vote and can participate in votes. And Congressman Lewis is absolutely correct. We've seen in election after election efforts made to keep people from voting. Wrong information being sent out intentionally. Trying to intimidate people from voting because they say you have any outstanding parking tickets, things like that. We see an election after election. Then we see state legislatures passing laws to make it more difficult for people to vote. That's not what this country was principled to this nation's, that we fought so long and hard in order to accomplish. So I thank you for bringing together this distinguished group, and I hope that we can today share information so that America can lead by example in making sure that everyone has the opportunity to vote in our elections.
Thank you, Senator. As this is a roundtable of House and Senate members, I'm going to alternate between bodies. I'd now like to ask Congressman Clyburn.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand, and thanks to my colleagues, John Lewis and other senators, and G.K. Butterfield for being here. I think one of the most interesting things about this issue is when the Supreme Court made its decision in Shelby, the Chief Justice Roberts wrote that they were making the decision that the formula was outdated, and he invited, in that opinion, Congress to address and update the formula. Now, many of us who were a part of the last reauthorization felt that we had updated the information. We conducted studies. We had a voluminous amount of cases and situations that called for the Voting Rights Act to remain intact. But because the formula was based upon that which was applied for the 1964 elections, though we had updated it, we were invited to modernize, to make current the formula. And we have done that in a bipartisan way. And I thank my colleagues for having done that. The problem now is that the leadership at least on the House side, has not allowed our work, the result of our work, to be brought to the floor. We've done the work. It's there. All that's required at this point is for the Speaker of the House to put the issue on the floor. And so I think that what's incumbent upon us to do here is not to continue to regurgitate facts that we know to be the case, but to do what is necessary to employ the leadership of the House and the Senate to put the issue on the floor. Do not deny us a vote, as so many of our states are denying our constituents an effective vote.
Thank you, Congressman. I'd now like to call upon Senator Dick Durbin.
Thanks, Senator Gillibrand, for convening this. I want to welcome my former colleagues and current colleagues from the House for joining us today. Congresswoman Sewell, Congressman Butterfield, Congressman Clyburn. We and I share responsibilities in opposite sides of the chamber. Absolutely. And of course, John Lewis. John, it was 11 years ago on a Sunday morning when you gave me a personal tour over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma and told me the story of what happened to you on that fateful day. It's one of the highlights of my congressional career to have spent that time with you. Thank you. Thank you for being there at that moment in history, and thank you for allowing so many of us to share in that experience through your eyes again in our lives. I was chair of the Constitution Subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee, so I decided to take my hearing on the road. I went to Ohio and I went to Florida, and it was all about voting rights. And in each of those venues, I called together elected election officials from those states, put them under oath, and asked them the following question. What was the incidence of voter fraud in your state that led your legislature to require voter IDs, to restrict access to the polls, and to limit the opportunities to vote for the people living in your state? I want to tell you what they said on the record, under oath. In Ohio, an election official said, contrary to the myth, voter fraud is extremely rare in this state and in this country. In Florida, an election official under oath, and they were from both political parties, said, voter fraud is not out there, end of quote. I then asked them, as a follow-up, how many cases of voter fraud prosecution have you had in the state of Ohio in the last 10 years or in the state of Florida in the last 10 years? They could think of one or two out of millions and millions of votes cast. Let's call this for what it is. This isn't about ending voter fraud. This is about suppressing the vote, discouraging people from voting. I can't think of any political position more antithetical for the party of Abraham Lincoln, but that is where they are today. They cannot keep up with the demographics of this country, which are bending against them, and so they try to suppress the vote. And the Supreme Court was complicit. In that Supreme Court decision, there was the presumption that the problems are behind us. Well, the problems of poll taxes and literacy tests and how many bubbles in a bar of soap may be behind us. But the problems we face with voter IDs that are totally unnecessary or burdensome on people and limiting opportunities to vote are very much in the news and should be on our mind. Thanks for bringing us together today. Let's focus on this to let the American people know. I'm prepared to accept the outcome of an election if everyone is given a free right to vote. That's what a democracy is all about. But when one party has a concerted effort and plan to discourage people from voting, they should be ashamed.
Our next speaker is Congressman G.K. Butterfield, who's the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand, and thank you to my Senate friends and to my House friends for coming today to participate in this very important discussion about voting rights in this country. I want to begin, if I can, my part of this discussion by telling a story that happened in my home community many years ago. When I was a younger member of Congress, I was reluctant to tell personal stories because I thought it was offensive to some people. But over the years, I've listened to Congressman Jim Clyburn tell very effectively stories about his personal life and his personal community. And so I want to share one that I think may be relevant to this conversation today. My dad was an African-American professional. He was a dentist. He graduated from Harry Medical School and moved to my hometown of Wilson, North Carolina, married my mother. At that time, there were only a handful of African-Americans registered to vote, and the white power structure called him in when he arrived in town and told him that they were going to do him a favor. They were going to allow him to register to vote, and that he did. Starting within a few days, he tried to get other African-Americans in town registered to vote, and he was reprimanded and almost run out of town for this conduct, and so he stopped it. 20 years later, he got back on the bandwagon again. He got the nerve to start a voter registration drive in the late 40s. He founded the NAACP chapter, and they went into existence for the sole purpose of registering African Americans to vote. The town was divided into 6 wards, and so they concentrated all of their voter registration efforts on Ward number 3, which is where the more informed African Americans live. And the voter registration drive was quite successful. And so in 1953, Dad ran for the Board of Aldermen from Ward 3 and was elected. And that sent shockwaves all across the town, as you can imagine. He stayed on the council for 4 years, and in 1957, while my family was away on a vacation, the city council called an emergency meeting and changed the method of election from district elections to at-large. And as you can imagine, when he ran in 1957, he came in last place. Not only did they move to at-large elections, but they also went to a required slate of 6. If you voted for 5, your ballot was discounted. You could not single-shot vote. You had to vote for a full slate. And I was 10 years old at the time and remembered so very well. And so I learned at a very young age that changes in voting laws can have a profound impact on the right to vote. And so that was the story that happened in my community, happened in communities all across the South. And that's what gave rise to the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act did away with the literacy test. Many people forget that, but that was very important. It eliminated the literacy test. It gave us Section 2, which we have used very effectively over the last 30 years in litigating and voting changes. But Section 5 has been the most powerful instrument that we've had in our toolbox in order to enforce voting rights. Southern states have disliked, they have hated, if you will, Section 5 from its inception because they knew the power of Section 5. So every challenge to Section 5 down through the years has been unsuccessful. But finally, in 2013, they prevailed. And in the Shelby case, and as Congressman Clyburn said, the ball is now in our court here in the Congress to update Section 4, the formula, so that Section 5 can be enforced. Until Section 5 is enforceable, we're going to continue to see spontaneous changes in election laws that are going to have a profound impact on minority voters. In closing, in my state of North Carolina, and you've seen this throughout the media, Shelby was on June 25th of 2013. On June 26th of 2013, the Speaker of our House of Representatives announced that now that he didn't have Section 5 to deal with, we were going to enact a voter ID law. And then on July 25th, which was 29 days later, not only did they roll out a voter ID law, but they rolled out a restriction on early voting and restriction on same-day registration and all of that. And it went into effect immediately with no Section 5 to contend with. And now the federal courts have spoken. In recent weeks, the federal court has decided unanimously that not only were those election changes a violation of the Voting Rights Act, but a violation of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, and that this conduct on the part of the Republican legislature was intentional, and that it was done with surgical precision in order to disenfranchise African-American voters. And so now we've reverted back to the pre-2013 law. And so thank you for your willingness to have this conversation. This is very important, not just to the African-American community, but to democracy. So thank you for your participation, and thank you for inviting me. All right.
Thank you. Congressman Sewell from Selma.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand, and all of the senators are here today. It's an honor for me to be a part of this panel, not just because I'm a member of Congress, but because I'm a member of Congress that grew up in Selma, Alabama, and represents Selma today. I think that this is, everyone says every presidential election is consequential, but this one truly is consequential. And it's the first time in over 50 years that we won't have the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. I cannot sit on a panel like this and look at John Lewis and not do everything I can to make sure that every American has the right to vote. I am honored that the Congressional Black Caucus, the Tri-Caucus, supported my bill. My bill was the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2015, H.R. 2867, and a companion bill was filed by Senator Leahy, and those senators who are here today signed on to that bill. We have over 187 signatures to the Voting Rights Advancement Act. When Shelby decision came down, it really was a challenge to Congress to come up with a modern-day formula. Well, that's what the Voting Rights Advancement Act does. Instead of looking back at 1960s and 1950s when Southern states discriminated against African American voters, and it has a 25-year look back. So it's modern. It's 1990 to the present, and states must have 5 or more statewide violations in order to be a part of the covered states. And 13 states fall within that category. Those states are not only Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, North Carolina, but Arizona, New York, California, Florida. 13 states would be covered. 13 states have had 5 or more statewide violations in the last 25 years. This is a clarion call for Congress to do something. We have a bill that on the Senate side and the House side has gained great momentum. The tragedy is not one single Republican has signed on the House bill, and only one Republican, senator from Alaska, has signed on to the Senate bill. This is really unacceptable when you look back at the history of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was truly not a partisan issue. Voting and the integrity of our democracy should not be a partisan issue. It should be truly bipartisan. And the fact that 10 years ago in 2006, the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized for 25 years, overwhelmingly in the Senate and in the House. What's happened in those intervening 10 years? We have to really check ourselves. You know, it's one thing to join John Lewis on a pilgrimage through Selma and Montgomery and Birmingham. And look, I'm honored that our members of Congress want to come through the district and trace the footsteps of John Lewis with John Lewis. But it's more than just walking across that bridge. It comes down to what is our true commitment to the integrity of our democracy. And there's no greater commitment that can be shown than to sign on to a modern-day formula, as the Supreme Court said, and restore the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act to its full glory. The fact that 13 states have had 5 or more violations in the last 20 years, 25 years, is a true testament. I'd like to end by telling my own story. Many of you have heard me say this, but I think it bears repeating. I had the great honor of having as my guest to the State of the Union in 2015, the oldest at the time living survivor of Bloody Sunday. Her name was Amelia Boynton Robinson. She was 104 years old. Many of you got a chance to meet with her then. I can remember being in the little vestibule off to the side of the chamber with her, waiting for President Obama to come in to greet her before he gave his speech. She was very, very excited, and every member of the cabinet came by and said the exact same thing. Oh, Ms. Boynton, we are so honored that you're here today. We wouldn't be in our positions, Secretary of HUD, Secretary of State, Secretary of Transportation, had it not been for your fight. By the time Eric Holder came through, she was tired of hearing that, and she literally looked up at them and said, "Do your own work. Get off my shoulders. Get off my shoulders. Do your own work." So I say to the senators and members of the House today, we have work to do. To our stakeholders, we have work to do. But there's no greater work to be done than to protect the integrity of our democracy. And there's no greater way that we can do that than to fully restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Gillibrand and Congressman Lewis and all the members that are here today, and for your great work and I think the excitement going into this election in terms of people understanding the importance of voting and registering like we've never had before. At the same time, we've had one pushback after another from various state legislators. I'm on the Judiciary Committee, and I have been just dismayed that we have not been able to get Republicans in the Senate to do what a few have done in the House, which is to lead an effort on the reauthorization. One of my most moving memories since I've been in the Senate is going with you on that trip to Selma and seeing that bridge. And while it was not the most famous weekend of the 50th anniversary, Kirsten and I were on the 48th, I think. And that was the weekend when the police chief gave you the badge and apologized 48 years later for what had happened, that the police hadn't stood up to protect you. And that was a moving moment as well. The two bills that I just wanted to throw in here that I think are very important and could make a big difference are, first of all, the Same-Day Registration Act. Keith Ellison is leading that in the House, and Senator Tester and I have been leading it in the Senate. And I find it to be a really interesting bill because when you look at voter turnout, if your idea is to get more citizens to vote, regardless of their political party, the same-day registration is kind of a simple, elegant way to do it. And in fact, I was just looking at the numbers as I came over here, and 5 of 6 of the states with the highest voter turnout have same-day registration. And they are not necessarily, for my Republican colleagues, all blue states. There are states like Iowa and New Hampshire. There are states that have a mixed bag in terms of what they have. Both of those states have Republican. One has a Republican senator, one has 2. So I don't see it as a partisan issue in that way. In our state, it has worked incredibly well to have same-day registration. The other bill is one that we just recently introduced, Senator Leahy and Durbin and myself, the Automatic Voting Rights Act. We introduced that in July. There's obviously a strong House bill which would automatically register people who are have already registered for their driver's license or other things, so they can register to vote at the same time. Kind of a opt-out, opt-in. It's so much smarter, and I know there's also a House bill on that. And I met with the Secretary of State of California when I was out at our convention in Philadelphia, and I know they've adopted that as well. So I think as we look at the importance of the voting rights reauthorization and some of these other bills to make it easier, these two have proven track records of getting people more registered. And while it has been difficult to get Republican support, that's putting it mildly, on some of these bills, I just find it interesting that states that are swing states like New Hampshire and Iowa, they do have these bills. They are proud of the number of people that they've turned out to vote, and there's just no reason we couldn't make that argument, as our bill does on the federal basis, to make it across the United States, or to encourage more states to adopt those laws. And having been the former prosecutor for our biggest county for 8 years and enforced the election laws, I can tell you the same-day registration, that we had just incredibly minor violations of it. I just remember one case that we had. Mostly we would get cases of sons and fathers with the same last names referred to us, and it turned out they were not double voting. I literally would go through those cases myself, and I saw how minuscule any problems were by having same-day registration, and so I can testify to it from that standpoint as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Now I'd like to call on Senator Booker.
First of all, my gratitude for this gathering and my appreciation to everybody here who's working so hard. I know a lot of issues have been covered or will be, and I know a lot of the legislation that's in process and the urgency behind it. I want to just focus on one issue that I feel a tremendous sense of frustration and anger because we go from my parents' generation of Jim Crow to where we are now, and perhaps one of the most effective way of disenfranchising African Americans, of casting folks into poverty, of restricting people from economic well-being, educational access, is just the explosion of the drug war and the hyper-incarceration reality we live in, and how it's disproportionately not just affecting African Americans, but frankly, as a black guy who grew up in a predominantly white area, it's predominantly focused on poor black and Latino areas. And as a result of that, when in terms of the voting rights context, it's stunning to me the level of disenfranchisement we see in our country. And you all know the statistics. This is all on my generation's watch. Since about 1980, we've seen our federal prison population go up 800%, our overall prison population go up 500%. This is not normal in our history. We used to have incarceration rates that were similar to our industrial peers. What that means in voting is stunning, to the point now we have 1 out of every 13 African Americans in general who have lost their rights to vote because of felony disenfranchisement. It's overwhelmingly concentrated in a handful of states. We have about 45% of the people who are disenfranchised in just 11 states. We have swing states like Florida, where 1 out of every 5 African Americans have lost their right to vote because of felony disenfranchisement. And that continues. In Kentucky, 22% of blacks have lost their right to vote. Virginia, and that's why I'm very happy with the governor's action, it was 20% of African Americans. And so I understand that a lot of the rolling back, our efforts to fight the impact of the Shelby decision are important, but a larger conversation that's affecting a much larger population of Americans in general, and black Americans in particular, really is stemming from felony disenfranchisement. And so there are definitely efforts going on, I know, in both houses, but it's something I just wanted to bring up and highlight today in this context.
I'd now like to turn to some of our advocacy organizations. Nancy Zirkin is at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights.
Thank you very much, Senator. Much appreciated. I am Nancy Zirkin, Executive Vice President of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, a national coalition of over 200 organizations. And I'd like to talk about the rampant voter discrimination that Kristen Clark will be addressing in specifics later. And it is the more outrageous because, as everybody says, we have 2 bipartisan bills that could be moved, but Republican leaders in the House and Senate and the Republican chairs of the House and Senate Judiciary Committees have refused to take any action to move these bills. Clearly, they are not doing their job. They're even refusing to hold hearings to review the mountains of evidence of voting discrimination happening nationwide. We've all heard about the court rulings, that court after court have validated the persistent discrimination that was exactly what VRA was designed to prevent. Yet still, Republican leadership would rather stick its head in the sand and pretend that all is well with voting. We have heard a lot of talk in this campaign season of a rigged election, but the real threat of a rigged election is from politicians trying to game the system by denying people of color and other vulnerable populations the right to vote. We are on a path in many states where black, brown, and other voters will be disenfranchised November 8th. Voters are supposed to choose who represents them in government. Politicians shouldn't be able to determine election outcomes by making it harder for a whole swath of citizens to make their choice, or to deny their vote altogether. And it's not like the 114th Congress has been all that productive that they don't have time to bring up these bills. If the Congress is any barometer, the Republican leadership seems to waste the nation's time on doing almost nothing. Our Supreme Court still has a vacancy and is creating uncertainty in the other courts across the country. They clearly haven't done their job. Members of Congress are supposed to work for the people, but Senate Majority Leader McConnell and House Speaker Ryan have not done their job. Their lack of action will deprive too many Americans of their right to vote. That's what I call a rigged election. Thank you.
I'd now like to call on Kristen Clark from the National Lawyers Committee.
Good morning. I want to thank Senator Gillibrand and Congressman Lewis for their leadership on these issues. I'm the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and one of the most important tasks that we undertake at the Lawyers Committee is work to defend voting rights for African Americans and other minority communities across the country. I want to talk briefly about what we are seeing right now across the country. Litigation in the post-Shelby era remains intense. We know that voting discrimination is a real problem. It is not hypothetical. Right now, we are fighting in Hancock County, Georgia, where election officials have undertaken an effort to clean up the registration rolls and have purged legitimately registered African Americans from the rolls. They engaged the sheriff's office in this scheme. The sheriff's office will be deployed to people's homes and tell you that you are being issued a summons to come down and establish your voting eligibility. We are fighting in Maricopa County against the long lines and 5-hour wait times that voters endured during this primary season. We do not believe that we should leave it to chance that election officials will get it right the next time. We are fighting in Macon, Bibb County, Georgia, where election officials sought to move a polling site from a majority black school to the local sheriff's office. And through our work and advocacy efforts, we were ultimately able to get that site moved back to a black church. We filed suit just last week in Georgia, where the Secretary of State's office has failed to process more than 42,000 registration forms from people who want to vote because of a restrictive practice that requires that every letter, every digit, every character on a registration form exactly match information contained in the state's database. And we know, Congressman Lewis, that those databases are riddled with errors and that this is a practice that disadvantages African Americans and minority voters in particular. I won't go through all of the litigation that is underway, but what I can tell you this is that the world has changed in the absence of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Officials at the state and local level have exploited every opportunity they can to institute or maintain discriminatory voting practices in the absence of Section 5. And each day that Congress fails to act, we not only subject African Americans and other minority voters to the recurring indignity of voting discrimination, but taxpayers suffer too. North Carolina has spent nearly $5 million defending its discriminatory voter suppression law. Texas has spent more than $3.5 million defending its discriminatory photo ID law. And the price tag increases each day as we continue to witness their recalcitrance and defiance from local elections in particular who seek to resist the recent rulings of the Fifth and Fourth Circuits, respectively. Voting discrimination, if not left unchecked, will stand as a stain on our democracy. It is bad for taxpayers, it is bad for Americans, and it is time for Congress to stop turning a blind eye to the resurgence of voting discrimination in our country. I'll close by just noting that we have this conversation today in the Lyndon B. Johnson room. And Lyndon B. Johnson, of course, is the one who signed our nation's most important federal civil rights law into effect. I hope that we can see some of the political will and courage that we saw when LBJ signed the Voting Rights Act into law today. We need some of that political will and courage that we saw back then, right now, to fight back against the voter suppression that stands as a threat to our democracy today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. That was helpful. I'd now like to call on Terry Au-Minnis, Asian Americans Advancing Justice.
Thank you, Senator. I am Terry Au-Minnis, Director of Census and Voting Programs at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. And I'm here today to talk about the Asian American electorate and sort of how these issues play out for our community. We have seen election after election the growing electorate of Asian Americans and both engagement, enthusiasm, and participation. Yet at the same time, we continue to see a significant gap between political participation of Asian Americans as compared to white voters. It's about a 15 to 20% gap election from election. Some of the factors that lead to this persistent gap include the language barrier. 3 out of 4 Asian Americans speak a language other than English at home, and almost half of Asian American adults have some difficulty with the English language. Another problem, of course, is voter discrimination and the voter suppression schemes that everybody has been talking about today. One thing that's interesting to note, as the fastest growing population in this country today, the region with the fastest growing Asian American population is actually the South. And so the Shelby decision was something that was particularly devastating to our ability to protect the voting rights of Asian Americans. Not only the protective measures of Section 5 as discussed by everybody, but as Congressman Lewis talked about, the federal observer piece, I think, is something that we are sorely missing in this upcoming election. We know that the federal observers are the eyes on the ground. They're the ones who are in the polling places and can see when voting discrimination is happening, when voter intimidation is happening, and so forth. And without that, those eyes on the ground, it makes it more difficult for us to understand fully what's happening and to be able to check these problems. With the potential increase in voter challengers this election, based off of some campaigns, making claims about elections being rigged and so forth, that is something that is particularly problematic for Asian American voters. We are particularly vulnerable because of the persistent stereotype of being perpetual foreigners. So voter challengers often will target Asian American voters because of the way they look, the way they sound, or even because of their name being seen as being quote unquote un-American and therefore somehow susceptible to being challenged. So I think when we take all of these factors into consideration, we see, as everyone has said today, it is critical that we address these issues. It's critical that Congress moves and passes the Voting Rights Advancement Act, and that we really do restore the Voting Rights Act to its full strength so that we can ensure the voting rights of all Americans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker is Andrea Centeno, a Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund.
Thank you so much, Senator Gillibrand. There, I have it on. I just want to start, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Senator Gillibrand, and thank you, Representative Lewis, for having me here today in this important discussion. My name is Andrea Centeno. I'm with the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. This particular election is pivotal for Latino voters. We are the second fastest growing group of Americans. Every 30 seconds, a Latino citizen turns 18 and is eligible to vote. Here we have 13.1 million Latinos are expected to cast a ballot in this election. This is certainly a critical time for our population, a critical time for our electoral empowerment. And if you look at our population, we're disproportionately young. We are the future of our electorate in many ways. 1 in 4 youth under 18 is Latino. And when you take all of that into consideration, the VRA is critical to our future and protecting the political voice of all of those young people here today. And so when we look at what that means for us, voter discrimination is not a thing of the past. The notion that this is something that that we have moved beyond this is simply untrue. In 2014, we put out a report detailing all of the numerous ways that Latino voters are discriminated against in America today. And to give you a specific example of what that looks like, in the city of Pasadena, Texas, shortly after the Shelby County decision, they voted to replace their 8 single-member voting district with a hybrid system that included 2 at-large seats. To give you a background of why, Pasadena's Hispanic citizen voting age population had grown from 30.6% in 2000 to 43% in 2012, according to the ACS data. This shows that in areas where Latinos are growing in power, we're growing in population, and we're starting to see a shift in our participation, there is an effort to embed political empowerment with the establishment in many locations. And so this is what we are fighting against present day, and this is why the Voting Rights Advancement Act is so critical to protecting our right to vote. The Voting Rights Advancement Act contains a number of very forward-thinking and forward and progressive notions of what voter protection needs to look like for the future. It's not simply trying to identify those bad actors with a history of discrimination, but also working to ensure that we are keeping pace with the new bad actors as they come along for our future population. This is incredibly important for Latino voters, but also for Asian American voters, for Native American voters, for any population that is up and coming. And so the Voting Rights Advancement Act provides those protections and is why it's so critical to our fight. And just to put into a larger context of why many Latinos are paying attention today to what is happening in our elections and to what is happening in our government, the notion of a vacancy at the Supreme Court in the future and what that might mean for deciding voting rights cases is acutely, very much directly touches Latino families. We are directly aware of what a vacancy and the inaction of our Supreme Court means for our individual families. Millions of Americans were devastated by the non-decision in US v. Texas. And to know that a 9th justice might have resolved the issue once and for all is something that many Latino voters are likely to take with them and consider as they go out to vote this year. And so just to end my remarks, for Latino voters, the stakes are incredibly high. When you consider all of these factors and the need to confront voter discrimination and voter suppression, to report it, to document it, and to help dismantle it is very, very real. In this cycle, we're going to have many people who are going to be motivated by the Supreme Court vacancy, and MALDEF and others remain very dedicated to be vigilant in monitoring and advocating for voters across the country. We strongly urge Congress to move and to hold hearings, to hold a vote on the Voting Rights Advancement Act, and to take action to protect our voters. Thank you very much for having me here today.
We still have 5 minutes, so if any of the members of Congress want to ask questions of our panel of organization experts, I think it's a great opportunity.
I have one, if I may. I'm particularly interested in Ms. Clark's litigation. Now, I think it's going to be long after the election before those issues are resolved legally. But the information, to me, that you just shared is the kind of information that needs to be into the broad electorate now. That's the kind of information, some of which is I'm hearing for the first time. I have not heard anything about that 42,000 number you talk about, and I try to keep up on this. Maybe you all have, but I've never heard it before. But that is the kind of thing that will drive people to help fashion some action by the Congress. Some kind of way we need to get this information. If you get it to me, I'll get it to others. But we need it.
I agree.
May I just add to that? I think that, I feel like I'm pretty close to these issues, but some of those things you said really shocked me. And so, one of the things, I just think that, darkness can't exist if you shine light on it. And I'd love to, you have the CBC as a whole. We could be putting that on our social media feeds, bring millions of people's attention to this outrageousness that's going on. So there's a way we could figure out a way to sort of highlight some of these, especially some of these cases, bring more media attention to them. I think it would be really helpful.
Yes, I agree. I think the takeaway is that voting discrimination is real. It is happening today. It is afoot at the state level. It is afoot at the local level. So we look forward to partnering with members of Congress so that they can, all members of Congress can understand that we need restoration of the Voting Rights Act to fight back against so much of the voter suppression that we're seeing. And I talked a great deal about Congressman Lewis's state, which has been keeping us incredibly busy. But we have voting rights lawsuits in Alabama, where, for example, the 3 highest courts in the state of Alabama today are all white. They elect their members at large. This is a state with the 6th largest black population, but because voting is so racially polarized, whenever black voters support candidates of choice, they are routinely defeated in elections there. And we are using the Voting Rights Act as a tool to help bring about diversity that's direly needed on the courts of Alabama. So all throughout the formally covered jurisdictions, we're seeing a stark contemporary, fresh record of discrimination, and we look forward to partnering with you to get this information out to the public.
I'm sorry.
Madam Chair, Senator, in the state of Georgia, the Secretary of State is the game caller. And he deliberate changing polling places in particular counties where there's a large concentration of African American voters, including Fulton County, where Atlanta is located, and part of my district. And doing things like dividing households. Husband and wife living in the same house for 40, 50 years, and sending the wife to one polling place and the husband to another polling place. This happened during the primary all across the state. And how do you deal with that? When we had the protection of the Voting Rights Act, before you can even change a polling place, you have to get approval, right? So I would like to see organization that you represent to start filing suits all over the place to dramatize the issue, to make it real, to make it plain.
If I could just jump in from the leadership conference. Other organizations are also filing suit, ACLU, LDF, NAACP. We all know that. But the Lawyers Committee and others have gathered a lot of information. We put out a report in June which was a compendium. Lawyers Committee has done a preliminary update, which I think you all have, at least we sent it over. Our problem is this, getting the word out. Now, we have several things planned, including a letter to all secretaries of state. And really, it's a communications effort. Because a lot of these secretaries of state, it doesn't matter what almost anybody says. So we need help, though. This letter is going to be going out in the next several weeks. We will be doing a lot of communications efforts. We do have people on the ground, but frankly, we're not really breaking through. And that's why we're starting to talk about rigged elections, because that term, I think, we think.
Yeah. Nancy,
know,
I'll
gets-
help you. On behalf of all the members of Congress here, I will work with you and Kristen to get all the information out, state by
Perfect.
state, and to generate some basic talking points based on the evidence that was presented today. So I'll work with each of you to marshal that evidence, give it to our colleagues, and we'll try to do it on a state-by-state basis, but also do some general talking points about how severe voting rights are being undermined across the country in this exact moment in time. And so I think that will help you amplify your message.
Everybody's message.
Yeah, and I'll make sure my folks here from press and my attorney, Maria Price, will also work with you to do that. So thank you.
Very quickly, Senator, may I?
ahead, yes.
Very quickly. Can you quantify the number of voting rights Section 2 cases that are pending in federal courts across the country? I mean, are there dozens or hundreds, or what would you guess?
I would put it in the dozens, and we can try to come up with a more
If
precise
we could just have a
number.
synopsis of each one and the factual basis for each one, it would be very helpful. Secondly, the Section 5 unit at DOJ, I don't know what they're doing now. I used to talk to Eric Older about it. And, you know, are those lawyers now litigating in Section 2?
We are
Yeah.
asking that exact question.
Yeah.
And
They had dozens of lawyers in the Section 5 unit.
it is not clear.
They need to move over to Section 2 and litigate more. Yeah, thank you. I yield back. All right.
To just close us out, please.
Well, I just want to thank each and every one of you for being here, for participating. You're right. To be sitting in this room, the LBJ room, I was in the audience on August 6, 1965, when President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. And 50 years later, we got to address some of the same issues and concern that act was supposed to solve. And as I've said on so many occasions, we cannot go back, we got to go forward. I think in America today, there's a tremendous amount of fear on the part of certain political players. The population is changing. The makeup of our country is changing. It's fear for the future. It's the fear. They want to stop us. We must not let that happen. If we fail to do what we must do, history will not be kind to us. And our democracy will not be what it should be. Open up the process and let everybody come in and participate. That's what we must do. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks for hosting this, yeah. Absolutely. How's everything going? And don't forget to think of me.
I was in part of your state. I was in Camden.
I saw the
Yeah, I went to that house where Dr. King used to live, and he was at Frozen. And it was wonderful. And I spent all day yesterday in Philadelphia. Can't forget.
people, I mean, I love how when you